Work began on architect Cass Gilbert's vision of the Minnesota State Capitol building in 1896. Located in the Capitol is the House Chamber. Here, the Minnesota House of Representatives gathers to carry out some of its duties.
Following House files have been offered for introduction today. The Chief Clerk will report these House files and give them their first reading,
including passing legislation that can affect a variety of areas.
We agreed with the Senate language. There were just some minor adjustments.
From civil law to health care, even the military. The legislature can pass bills that recognize and honor the service of those in uniform. The state of Minnesota has a long tradition of its soldiers defending the country. The first time Minnesota offered its services for national military service was during the Civil War. The unit was the 1st Regiment of Minnesota Volunteer Infantry. The regiment played a crucial role in the Battle of Gettysburg. On the second day of the battle, the regiment helped stop the advance of Wilcox's brigade. The Battle of Gettysburg is often described as the war's turning point, turning the tide in favor of the Union. The House Chamber speaks of the Civil War. Above the Speaker's chair hangs a portrait of Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States during this very challenging time in the nation's history. Inside the House Chamber looks at the history of this artifact and its place of honor in the House Chamber. George Healy, a renowned artist of the 1800s, painted the original image. Robert Todd Lincoln once said that the original was the finest likeness of his father ever painted. Brian Pease, the site manager of the Capitol for the Minnesota Historical Society, shares the historical account of the image.
George Healy was an artist who had painted Abraham Lincoln and General Sherman and General Grant at the end of the war in a large painting called The Peacemakers. And in that pose of Lincoln, he has him sitting in a chair with his hand, just like we see in the portrait here. In the 1880s, he was doing a competition in Paris, and so he decided, I'm going to paint or take that portrait of Lincoln and put that in my painting, but he made a couple of copies also.
One of the portraits Abraham Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, would come to own. Another would be owned by Elihu Washburn, a representative from Illinois and a close friend of Abraham Lincoln.
Elihu Washburn took his, of course, back home with him. He gave it to his brother, or sold it to his brother, William Washburn, who was a U.S. Senator from Minnesota. And so when this Capitol opened, it wasn't right away, but a few years after the Capitol opened, he decided, let's put that on display in this Minnesota State Capitol above the Speaker's desk. And so that was on display here until the 1930s when the family wanted the painting back. Well, that went, like the large statuary group, that became a part of the history, part of the recognition of that space.
An artist was commissioned to create a copy of the Lincoln portrait to put in the vacant spot. The copy is so exact that some say experts can't tell the difference from the original.
Edward Brewer, a St. Paul artist, was hired to do an exact copy of that original portrait. And so what we have hanging behind the Speaker's desk is the copy of Abraham Lincoln.
So the portrait of Abraham Lincoln, now in the House Chamber, is a copy of the portrait the Washburn family lent to the chamber shortly after the Capitol opened. The Washburn family painting is now in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. Some rumors had been floated around that it was hung in the White House.
A lot of people thought this one, after it left the state capitol, went to the White House and was in the dining room, but that was actually the one that Robert Lincoln had. And so because there's these 3 paintings floating around, it's hard to know where they were ending up at different times.
Here's a list of where the 3 original Healy portraits have ended up. The Washburn copy is at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. The Robert Todd Lincoln copy is in the White House State Dining Room, and the portrait that was used in the Paris competition by Healy is now at the Newberry Library in Chicago, Illinois. When it comes to the 3 original portraits, Healy wasn't satisfied to make them all the same.
He did do some little bit subtle changes.
Most striking is the Washburn family portrait and the Paris competition portrait show Abraham Lincoln in a plain brown chair, whereas the Robert Todd Lincoln portrait shows Abraham Lincoln in a different chair.
Had a little bit more of a rococo or kind of a gilding on the chair.
Abraham Lincoln led the country through a very trying time and has become one of the most revered presidents in the nation's history. The image of Abraham Lincoln above the Speaker's desk has also garnered some recognition and become a part of the history of the House chamber. Ed Burdick, the late chief clerk of the Minnesota House of Representatives, once said if the portrait could talk, it would, quote, tell a story of drama, politics, suspense, intense debate, dedication, parliamentary law, and interesting personalities. No doubt, as we look forward to the future, more stories will unfold.